Today, I'll be talking about the very intense Cuban Missile Crisis in 4 minutes. Thanks to the bravery of two men, Premier Nikita Khrushchev and President John F. Kennedy, nuclear war was averted. It all began with Soviet Union being behind the US in the arms race. US missiles were capable of striking the entire Soviet Union. So Khrushchev thought, hey, what if we put missiles in Cuba to gain some ground and to gain some control? Fidel Castro was looking for a way to defend his island nation from invasion, like in JFK's Bay of Pigs operation, where Cuban exiles were trained to rebel against Castro, but ultimately JFK's plan failed miserably. And knowing that a second attack was very possible, Castro believed that a direct attack by the US would cause a world war, so as a result, Castro approved of Khrushchev's plan of installing missiles in Cuba. Though it wasn't until October 14, 1962 that a U-2 spy plane found evidence of the missile installations in Cuba. And JFK found out later on the 15th, and this is when Cuban Missile Crisis officially began. So JFK organized the XCOM for deliberation on course of action. Then on the 17th, JFK flew to Connecticut while his brother Robert Kennedy and Theodore Sorensen filled him in with the details. They find out that Joint Chiefs of Staff and Air Force argued for an airstrike while others supported a blockade. Then JFK met with the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, in which he told JFK that these missiles are merely for Cuban defense. Then on the 20th, JFK ordered a naval quarantine around Cuba. And please note that JFK requested not a blockade, but a quarantine. Then on the 21st, the U-2 flight revealed bombers and MiGs being assembled on the island, though it wasn't until the 22nd that JFK did a televised speech informing the audience or the public of the missiles and his plan. Then after that, the US military forces go to DEFCON 3, and the OAS approves the quarantine, though tensions rose when Soviet ships approached the quarantine line, but they luckily slowed down and reversed their course, to the US's relief. Now the military goes to DEFCON 2, the highest ever in US history. Then on the 25th, JFK puts the responsibility of the crisis on Khrushchev. Then, later on, XCOM discusses withdrawing Soviet missiles in Cuba in exchange for the withdrawal of US missiles from Turkey. On the 26th, Soviet cargo ship Marukla is cleared through the quarantine, which is an intense moment of the Cuban missiles crisis. And JFK declared that the quarantine is not enough to enforce removal of the missiles. So later on, the CIA reports that missiles are still developing in the country and that they are even now camouflaging the missiles. Soviet spy Alexander Fomin met with ABC News reporter John Scaly, in which Scaly devised a plan of Soviet removing the missiles if Kennedy promises never to invade Cuba. Khrushchev is also on the same page with Scaly, and even sends a letter to JFK requesting to announce that he will never invade Cuba. However, the most intense moment of the crisis was on the 27th, when a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba and one flew over Alaska near Soviet territory. And later on, Khrushchev sends another letter proposing public trade of Soviet missiles in Cuba for US missiles in Turkey. Apparently the night before, in his meeting with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin, Robert Kennedy brought Turkey into question. However, JFK feared that removing missiles from Turkey will make them lose a NATO ally. So he writes Khrushchev back and states that they will not invade Cuba if he removes the missiles from the island, but waiting for a response was extremely intense because once an invasion had started, a nuclear war would commence. Then luckily on the 28th, Radio Moscow finally revealed that Khrushchev complies with JFK, and as a result, Khrushchev will remove the missiles from Cuba. However, the person most furious by this decision was Castro, who felt betrayed by Khrushchev. And then over the next several months, missiles in Cuba were sent back to the Soviet Union, and missiles in Turkey were sent back to the US. And later on, JFK and Khrushchev even signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in August of 1963. However, JFK was assassinated later that year, and Khrushchev died almost 8 years later. But the question remains, what if they stayed in power? Perhaps these two men who brought us close to nuclear war, now changed by that experience, might have just brought us far away from it. The end.